Welcome back to another journey into the deep lore of Halo. Tonight we're venturing into the ancient past, more than 100,000 years before humanity ever set foot among the stars, to explore one of the most fascinating aspects of Forerunner civilization. Their society wasn't built on equality or individual choice as we might understand it. Instead, the Forerunners organized themselves into a rigid hierarchy of specialized castes, each designed to fulfill a specific function within their galaxy-spanning empire. These weren't merely career paths or social classes. They were rates, fundamental divisions that shaped not just what a Forerunner did, but what they physically became. The Forerunners called their empire the Ecumene, a vast dominion that stretched across 3 million fertile worlds. They were beings of such advanced technology and power that species which came after could only regard them as gods. Yet for all their achievements, the megastructures that defy comprehension, and the weapons that could sterilize galaxies, the Forerunners were ultimately undone by the very system that made them great. Their caste structure, their rates, created specialization so extreme that when catastrophe arrived in the form of the parasitic flood, the rigidity of their society became a fatal weakness. But before we explore how it all fell apart, we need to understand how it worked. The Forerunner rate system was elegant in its design, pragmatic in its execution, and utterly transformative in its implementation. When a young Forerunner reached maturity, they didn't simply choose a profession or attend a university. They underwent physical mutation, a biological transformation that would reshape their body to match the requirements of their chosen rate. A builder would develop multiple arms for intricate work. A warrior servant would grow larger, stronger, more imposing. A life worker might become graceful and tall, their form optimized for careful, deliberate work with living organisms. This wasn't cosmetic modification. This was fundamental alteration of the Forerunner form, carried out through genetic manipulation, biochemical treatments, and technologies we can barely imagine. The rates weren't just social categories, they were physical realities carved into flesh and bone, made permanent through transformation. Once you committed to a rate, there was no going back. Your body had been changed. Your very physiology now defined your role in society. And there were clear hierarchies within this system. At the top stood the builders, the architects and engineers who designed the Forerunners' greatest works. Below them came the miners, who manipulated stars and shattered planets to provide raw materials. The Lifeworkers specialized in medicine and biology, preserving and studying life throughout the galaxy. The Juridicals maintained law and order, investigating crimes and ensuring adherence to the mantle of responsibility. The warrior servants, despite their crucial military role, ranked second lowest in the social hierarchy during the final millennia of Forerunner civilization. Victims of political maneuvering and shifting power dynamics that stripped them of their former prominence. There were others too. Engineers maintained technology and machinery, their bodies modified to interface directly with the systems they serviced. Theoreticals once pursued pure scientific research, before their entire rate was forcibly absorbed by the builders. Weavers told stories and kept cultural memory alive until they too were assimilated. The rate system was not static. It evolved, contracted, and adapted as the Forerunners' needs changed over millions of years of history. Tonight, we're going to explore the 4 major rates that defined late Forerunner civilization. We'll walk through their responsibilities, their achievements, and the individuals who embodied the best and worst of what each rate represented. We'll see how builders constructed wonders and wielded political power with ruthless efficiency. We'll discover how Lifeworkers struggled to preserve life even as their civilization prepared to extinguish it. We'll witness warrior servants fighting battles on scales we can barely comprehend, only to be betrayed by the very society they protected. And we'll observe Juridicals attempting to maintain justice and order as everything collapsed around them. This is the story of a civilization so advanced it could build artificial worlds and manipulate the fabric of space itself, yet so rigid in its structure that when flexibility was needed most, it simply couldn't adapt. This is the story of the Forerunner rates and how a system designed to create perfection ultimately guaranteed extinction. The Builders, architects of empire and power. If you wanted to understand Forerunner civilization at the height of its power, you needed to understand the Builders. They weren't merely the highest-ranked rate in Forerunner society. They were the beating heart of everything the Ecumene accomplished. The visionaries and craftsmen who transformed abstract concepts into physical reality on scales that dwarfed planets. When you looked at a halo ring spinning silently in the void, when you witnessed the Ark's impossible architecture bridging the gap between galaxies, when you studied the shield worlds that could fold space itself to create protected sanctuaries, you were seeing the work of builder hands and builder minds. The Builders occupied the apex of Forerunner social hierarchy, and they wielded that position with a combination of genuine brilliance and calculated political maneuvering. In formal contexts, they were referred to as the Builder Corps, an acknowledgement of their organized, almost military approach to large-scale construction and technological development. But make no mistake, this was no humble guild of craftsmen. The Builders controlled wealth on scales that made entire planets personal property.
They commanded political power that could override the decisions of other rates. They shaped the direction of Forerunner civilization through their control of technology and infrastructure. When a young Forerunner committed to the Builder rate, they underwent mutations that equipped them for their role. Builder forms often featured multiple arms, 4 being common for those engaged in complex manipulation tasks. Their bodies developed enhanced spatial reasoning, the ability to visualize structures in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Their nervous systems adapted to interface directly with construction protocols and planning systems. Some builders developed additional sensory organs that allowed them to perceive architectural stress points or detect flaws in materials at molecular levels. The physical changes marked only the beginning. Builders inherited cultural traditions stretching back millions of years. They memorized the names of their ancestors, recitations that could take hours to complete. prayers to be spoken when facing certain death. They studied ancient symbols based on designs from warships 10 million years old, secret society rituals that connected modern builders to their distant past. There was pride in this rate, a sense of superiority that came not just from social position, but from genuine accomplishment. Builders had reshaped the galaxy. They had turned their species' dreams into stone and metal and hard light. They had earned their place at the top. But with power came arrogance. And with arrogance came the seeds of catastrophe. Builders, for all their genius, were also economically motivated and ambitious in ways that could turn dark. Certain builder families accumulated wealth so vast they owned entire planets as personal estates. The competition for prestigious projects and lucrative contracts created a culture where political scheming became as important as engineering skill. Builders learned to manipulate council decisions, to position rivals for failure, to advance through means both fair and foul. The chief of the builder rate held the title of Master Builder, and this position represented the most powerful individual in all of Forerunner civilization. The Master Builder commanded not just the builder rate, but all its constituent guilds and subdivisions. They alone knew the location of the crystal from which slipspace flakes were harvested, the material that made faster-than-light travel possible. This secret gave the Master Builder effective control over the Forerunner's ability to traverse the stars, leverage that could be used to devastating political effect. The last Forerunner to hold this title was an individual named Faber of Will and Might, and his story illustrates everything the builder rate could be, at its best and worst. Faber was brilliant. There's no denying that. His vision for defending against the flood involved constructing the Halo Array, a series of massive ring-shaped weapons capable of wiping out all sentient life in the galaxy. It was a solution of terrifying scale and scope, exactly the kind of audacious engineering that defined builder thinking. If the problem was a galaxy-spanning parasite that consumed all life, the builder solution was to build weapons that could kill everything, starving the parasite into submission. But Faber was also ruthless, manipulative, and willing to commit atrocities to achieve his goals. When the Forerunners encountered the flood's imprisoned intelligence, the entity known as the Primordial, Faber saw an opportunity for experimentation. He authorized the use of human specimens in horrific tests, attempting to find a cure for the flood by exposing humans to various forms of infection and studying the results. When the Sanshayum on Jonjer-Kam rebelled against Forerunner oversight, Faber responded by test-firing a Halo installation at their homeworld, an unsanctioned use of a weapon of mass destruction that violated every principle the Forerunners claimed to uphold. The tragedy of Faber, and of the builder rate he represented, was that their technical competence far exceeded their wisdom. They could solve any engineering problem, construct any structure, build weapons of unimaginable power, but they lacked the ethical framework to use that power responsibly. Faber's Halo project was opposed for years by the Didact and the warrior servants, who argued for a different defensive strategy using shield worlds. The Didact's plan would have saved lives, preserved civilization, allowed the Forerunners to weather the flood storm and emerge intact. But Faber outmaneuvered the Didact politically.
using his builder connections and council influence to marginalize the warrior servants and push through the Halo strategy. It wasn't that the Halos didn't work. They worked exactly as designed, but their existence as a final solution allowed Faber and other builders to pursue increasingly reckless strategies against the Flood, secure in the knowledge that they had a reset button. Why fight carefully when you could ultimately just wipe the board clean and start over? The Builder Rate's relationship with other castes revealed much about Forerunner society's power dynamics. Builders had absorbed several rates over the millennia, including the Theoreticals and Weavers, consolidating power by eliminating potential rivals. They treated miners as useful servants, valuable for their expertise, but not worthy of true political partnership. They viewed Lifeworkers with a mixture of respect and condescension, acknowledging their skill with living systems while dismissing their ethical concerns as impractical sentimentality. Their attitude toward warrior servants was more complex, a blend of fear, resentment, and barely concealed contempt. The warriors represented everything builders disliked: direct physical action, military authority, adherence to codes of honor that seemed quaint and inefficient. Worse, the warriors had political traditions stretching back to when their rate stood highest in Forerunner society, before the builders' rise to dominance. The Didact, as supreme commander of Forerunner military forces and a Promethean of ancient lineage, could challenge builder authority in ways no other individual could match. So the builders worked systematically to undermine warrior servant power. After the human Forerunner War ended, they used political pressure to disband warrior fleets, fold military assets into builder security forces under builder command, and marginalize warrior influence on the council. When the Didact opposed the Halo strategy too effectively, Faber engineered circumstances that led to the Didact's exile in a cryptum, a stasis prison. For thousands of years, the builders enjoyed near total control of Forerunner civilization, their rate unchallenged at the summit of power. This dominance showed in their architectural achievements. The Halo installations themselves represented builder philosophy incarnate, elegant solutions to complex problems, executed with perfection and deployed at galaxy-spanning scale. Each ring was 10,000 kilometers in diameter, massive enough to contain entire ecosystems on its inner surface, yet precisely engineered to function as both habitat and weapon. The rings could be transported via slipspace, positioned strategically throughout the galaxy, and linked into a single network controlled from Installation 00, the Ark. The Ark itself demonstrated builder capabilities even more dramatically. Located outside the galaxy entirely, this flower-shaped megastructure served as both construction facility and sanctuary. Inside its petals, entire halo rings could be forged from raw materials, assembled by armies of sentinels and constructor drones following builder designs. The Ark drew resources from captured stars, processed materials on scales that would reduce planets to component atoms, and output finished installations ready for deployment. Two such arcs existed: the greater arc that built the original, larger halo rings, and the lesser arc that produced the current, smaller array. Shield worlds represented another builder triumph.
though one championed by warriors rather than builders themselves. These structures folded space into compressed dimensions, creating protected zones where populations could shelter during the Halo activation. The largest shield world, Requiem, served as the Didact's fortress, a world compressed into dimensions that seemed impossible. Larger inside than its exterior dimensions suggested. Builders understood the mathematics of slip space well enough to make this work, to create stable dimensional pockets that could house entire civilizations indefinitely. Beyond these famous structures, builders created countless other wonders, planetary reformers that could dismantle worlds in hours and reshape them into new configurations, sentinels of various classes, from diminutive constructors to massive retriever sentinels that could harvest entire moons for raw materials. Slip space drives that allowed instantaneous travel across galactic distances. War sphinxes and other combat platforms used by warrior servants. Medical facilities where Lifeworkers could perform procedures that blurred the line between healing and resurrection. Yet for all their achievements, the Builders' legacy is ultimately one of failure. Their rigid control of Forerunner society prevented adaptation when flexibility was needed. Their absorption of other rates eliminated diverse perspectives that might have offered alternative solutions. Their marginalization of the warrior servants left the Forerunners unprepared when the flood returned in force. And their commitment to the Halo strategy, that final solution that could kill everything, meant that when all other options failed, genocide became not just possible, but inevitable. Faber himself came to recognize this in his final hours. During the Battle of the Greater Ark, with the flood overwhelming Forerunner defenses and all hope lost, Faber took command of Omega Halo, one of the original larger rings. He could have tried to escape, could have preserved himself for some hypothetical future. Instead, he chose to detonate the ring at point-blank range, sacrificing himself in a last, desperate attempt to damage the flood's momentum. His final words acknowledged what he had done. Throughout my life, I sought power and profit for myself, for my right. Now, at long last, I think I understand the meaning of a crime against the mantle. This was the Builder rate, architects of empire and engineers of extinction, brilliant beyond measure, yet fatally flawed in their wisdom. They built wonders that would endure for 100,000 years after their civilization's fall. But they also built the very weapons that ensured that fall would be absolute and final, sterilizing the galaxy they had worked so hard to perfect. The Mine Miners, foundation of the Forerunner machine. While builders occupied the spotlight, designing megastructures and wielding political power, another rate labored in conditions that would kill lesser beings, performing the crucial work that made all builder achievements possible. The miners ranked second in the Forerunner social hierarchy, But this position understated their importance to the Ecumene. Without miners, there would be no materials for construction. Without their expertise, the vast engines of Forerunner industry would grind to a halt. The builders might design the halo rings, but miners provided every atom that made those rings possible. The miner rate specialized in resource acquisition at scales that beggar imagination. They didn't simply dig holes in the ground or operate conventional excavation equipment. Miners manipulated matter at fundamental levels, restructured planetary cores, and reached into the hearts of stars to harvest elements that could only exist under conditions of impossible temperature and pressure. They were stellar engineers, planetary surgeons, and cosmic quartermasters all in one. When Forerunner civilization required specific materials, perhaps exotic elements that only formed in stellar furnaces, or rare isotopes found in the depths of gas giants, miners went to work. They would identify suitable stellar bodies using sophisticated scanning technology that could detect the precise atomic signatures they needed. Then they would deploy to those locations with equipment designed to extract materials under conditions that would vaporize conventional tools. Minor stellar engineers earned the nickname plasma jockeys for good reason. These specialists entered stellar atmospheres, descending into fusion furnaces where temperatures measured in millions of degrees. They wore specialized combat skins, advanced armor far beyond anything warrior servants used, environmental suits that could maintain internal temperatures while their exterior surfaces glowed white hot. Even with this protection, stellar engineering remained desperately dangerous work. The plasma jockeys would deploy their equipment into the star's interior layers, using containment fields and collection arrays to harvest specific materials. They manipulated stellar processes, sometimes accelerating fusion reactions in localized areas to produce desired elements, other times extracting material directly from the star's convective zone. The work required third-class ancillas, highly intelligent artificial minds that could process the torrential data streams and make split-second decisions about field configurations and extraction parameters. Many plasma jockeys simply disappeared after a few hundred years of this work. The miners never discovered what happened to them. Perhaps the ancillas achieved some form of transcendence, ascending to higher states of existence. Perhaps they were destroyed by stellar phenomena beyond even Forerunner understanding. Perhaps they just decided they'd had enough and departed for regions unknown. The miners didn't know, and more pragmatically, they didn't need to know. The plasma jockeys accomplished their missions before vanishing, and that was what mattered. Planetary engineering represented the other major aspect of miner work, and here their capabilities demonstrated power on scales usually reserved for geological processes. When the Forerunners needed a new world, perhaps to establish a research station or create a strategic military base, they didn't wait for natural planetary formation processes to play out over billions of years. They called in the miners. The process began with target selection. Asteroid fields made ideal starting material. Billions of tons of rock and metal already concentrated in relatively small volumes of space. Miners would deploy equipment that generated powerful gravitational fields, drawing asteroids together, collapsing the field into a dense, compact mass. As more and more material accumulated, the protoplanetary body would heat from gravitational compression and collision energy, becoming a molten sphere perhaps 20 megameters in diameter. Then came the refinement phase. Miners used containment fields to shape the molten mass, adjusting its composition by introducing additional elements or removing unwanted materials. They controlled cooling rates with precision, allowing different layers to solidify at specific times to create desired geological structures. The entire process, from scattered asteroids to stable, cooled terrestrial planet, took less than 10,000 years. By geological standards, this was instantaneous planetary formation at hyperspeed. Gas giants required similar but distinct processes. Here, miners worked with stellar nebulae or collected hydrogen and helium from various sources, using gravitational manipulation to compress these gases into planetary bodies. The physics were more complicated, the timescales slightly longer, but miners could produce gas giants when needed, custom designed to specific parameters. Planetary destruction fell under miner purview as well. When resources locked inside a planet's core needed extraction, miners didn't waste time with conventional drilling. They used their orbital reformers, massive installations like the one at X50 near Drithius 5. These platforms could project energy beams of such intensity that they could dismantle an entire planet in a matter of hours, reducing solid world to component materials ready for harvest and processing. The installation at X50 demonstrated miner capabilities and philosophy perfectly. This artificial moon orbited Drithius 5, monitoring the planet and preparing for eventual resource extraction. When activated, its energy beam could cut through planetary crust like a torch through fabric, exposing the mantle and core, breaking apart the planet's structure until nothing remained but conveniently sized debris fields ready for collection. Miners could theoretically perform even more energetic planetary destruction, but the X50 model represented standard practice. For more localized operations, miners employed specialized ships equipped with powerful energy fields that could rapidly excavate large masses of minerals and ore. These vessels didn't rely on mechanical tools like drills or shovels. Instead, they used directed force fields to phase rock out of existence, teleporting material directly into cargo holds. A single mining ship could strip mine an entire mountain range in hours, leaving mathematically precise excavations behind.
The minor rates' physical forms reflected their harsh working environments. They tended toward stockier, more robust builds than other rates, their bodies modified for resilience rather than speed or grace. Their sensory systems adapted to perceive through the electromagnetic noise of stellar environments or the crushing pressures of planetary depths. Many miners developed additional organs that could process toxic materials or survive brief exposure to hard vacuum. Fail-safe systems for when environmental suits failed. Culturally, miners were known for their direct, no-nonsense approach to communication and problem-solving. They lacked the political sophistication of builders or the philosophical bent of lifeworkers. When a miner spoke, they tended toward bluntness, stating facts without elaborate social preamble or diplomatic hedging. This directness sometimes created friction with other rates, particularly status-conscious builders. But miners genuinely didn't care about such concerns. They had work to do, and social niceties didn't extract rare elements from stellar cores. This practical focus meant miners remained largely outside the political struggles that consumed so much builder and warrior servant attention. They didn't seek power for its own sake, didn't scheme for council positions or lobby for rate advancement. The miners understood that their expertise made them valuable regardless of political standing. Every rate needed materials. Every construction project required resources. The Forerunners' entire civilization depended on miner output, which gave them security and influence without requiring political maneuvering. But the miners held secrets, knowledge they guarded carefully and shared selectively. Long before the flood crisis, even before the human Forerunner wars, miners had developed a fascination with the precursors, the ancient beings who preceded the Forerunners and might have created them. The miners wanted to understand precursor technology, particularly their material sciences and construction techniques. If the precursors could build structures that lasted billions of years, structures that seemed to violate physical laws, miners wanted to know how. At the direction of their rate's eldest leaders, minor manipulars scoured the galaxy and even ventured into the exotic depths of slipspace, searching for specific stellar signatures that indicated precursor activity. When promising targets were identified, these bodies, entire stars or planetary systems, were transported at tremendous cost to a specialized world engine at the Ecumene's periphery. There, in absolute secrecy, they were deconstructed, analyzed, studied for any trace of precursor knowledge. What the miners learned from these investigations remained locked in their collective memory, never shared with other rates, not even recorded in the domain where other Forerunners might access it. This knowledge died with them when the Halo array fired. Secrets about Forerunner origins and precursor capabilities lost forever. Perhaps it's better that way. The precursors became the flood. Their godlike powers turned to nightmarish purposes. Whatever the miners discovered probably wouldn't have changed the war's outcome and might have made things worse. The miner rate's contribution to Forerunner civilization cannot be overstated. Every builder triumph, every megastructure, every technological marvel required materials that miners provided. The halo rings needed exotic metals that could withstand the immense stresses of containing superweapon energies. The Ark required stellar-scale quantities of construction materials. Shield worlds needed stable, exotic matter to maintain their dimensional compressions. All of this came from miner hands. Yet they received relatively little recognition for this work. The builders claimed glory for the finished products. Warrior servants earned fame for their military victories. Lifeworkers gained respect for their humanitarian efforts. Miners just worked, day after day, century after century, breaking apart worlds and diving into stars, providing the raw materials that kept Forerunner civilization functioning. In the final days, when the flood overwhelmed the Ecumene and the decision to activate the Halo Array became inevitable, miners faced the end with the same pragmatic acceptance they brought to everything else. There was work to be done. Preparing the Ark for the reseeding of the galaxy, processing materials for emergency construction projects, maintaining systems even as the flood corrupted and consumed everything around them. The miners worked until they couldn't work anymore, and then they died, leaving behind the fruits of their labor and the legacy of a rate that built the foundations of everything the Forerunners achieved. The Lifeworkers, biology, medicine, and the burden of preservation. If the builders represented the Forerunners' technological prowess and the miners embodied their industrial might, the Lifeworkers carried the soul of Forerunner civilization. Their rate specialized in the study and preservation of life in all its forms, from the smallest microorganisms to the most complex sentient species. They were physicians and biologists, geneticists and ecologists, philosophers and ethicists all rolled into one. More than any other rate, the Lifeworkers took seriously the mantle of responsibility, that Forerunner philosophy which held that advanced civilizations had a duty to protect and nurture less developed life. The Lifeworker rate ranked third in the Forerunner social hierarchy, below both builders and miners, but above the warrior servants. This middle position reflected their specialized expertise, valuable enough to command respect, but not quite crucial enough to challenge builder political dominance. Yet in many ways, Lifeworkers wielded influence that transcended their official ranking, particularly through their control of medical services and their moral authority when questions of life and death arose. When a Forerunner committed to the Lifeworker rate, their physical transformation emphasized grace and precision rather than raw power or industrial resilience. Lifeworker forms typically grew tall and slender, their movements fluid and deliberate. Some variants developed the ability to hover or float rather than walk, drifting through. Their laboratories and research stations with an almost ethereal quality, Their hands remained nimble, capable of microscopic manipulation, while their sensory systems adapted to perceive biological processes at cellular and molecular levels. The mutations went deeper than mere physical modification. Lifeworkers developed intuitive understanding of living systems, an almost empathic connection to the organisms they studied. They could observe a creature and comprehend its evolutionary history, its ecological niche, its genetic potential. This wasn't mysticism. It was advanced pattern recognition and biological analysis operating at subconscious speeds, their enhanced minds processing information faster than deliberate thought could manage. Lifeworker culture emphasized patience, careful observation, and respect for the autonomy of living things. Where builders saw problems to solve through engineering solutions, and miners viewed matter as raw material to be extracted and processed, lifeworkers understood life as something sacred, deserving protection and study rather than exploitation. This philosophical difference created inevitable friction with other races, particularly during the flood crisis, when builders advocated for solutions that required the destruction of life on galactic scales. The highest rank achievable by a lifeworker was Life Shaper, effectively the leader of the entire race. In all of Forerunner history, only 4 individuals ever received this title, a testament to the position's demanding standards. The most famous life shaper, and perhaps the most significant lifeworker in recorded history, was an individual known as First Light Weave's Living Song, though she went by the simpler designation, the Librarian. The Librarian embodied everything noble about the lifeworker rate, while also demonstrating the tragic limits of moral conviction in the face of existential crisis. She dedicated herself to the preservation of life throughout the galaxy, not just Forerunner life, but all sentient species and the ecosystems that supported them. When the builders proposed the Halo Array as their solution to the flood threat, the Librarian immediately recognized the moral catastrophe this represented. Weapons specifically designed to commit genocide on the largest possible scale. She opposed the Halo strategy vocally and persistently, arguing before the Ecumene Council that building such weapons violated the fundamental principles of the mantle of responsibility. How could the Forerunners claim to be protectors of life while simultaneously preparing to extinguish all life? The contradiction was absolute, the hypocrisy undeniable. But the Librarian's opposition faced an insurmountable obstacle. The builders controlled the council, and they had already decided the halos were necessary. Faced with inevitable defeat on the larger question, the Librarian shifted her strategy. She couldn't stop the halos from being built, but she could ensure that their activation wouldn't mean permanent extinction. She proposed the conservation measure, an ambitious project to catalog and preserve specimens of every significant species in the galaxy. When the halos fired and killed all sentient life within range, these preserved specimens could be used to reseed the galaxy, restoring biological diversity and giving civilizations a chance to develop again. To force builder acceptance of this plan, the Librarian employed the considerable leverage Lifeworkers possessed. She threatened to halt all medical operations throughout the Ecumene if the Council refused her demands. Without Lifeworker support, builders would have no health care for their workers. Miners would suffer from industrial accidents without treatment. Warrior servants would lack battlefield medicine. The Council, recognizing they couldn't function without Lifeworker cooperation, agreed to integrate the conservation measure into the Halo strategy. This compromise gave Lifeworkers extensive biological preserves on builder installations, including the Halo rings themselves, and both ARC facilities. The Librarian could establish her research stations, deploy her teams to index species, and prepare for the terrible day when the halos might need to fire. The work was monumental in scope, requiring the cataloging of billions of species, the preservation of genetic material, the documentation of cultures and civilizations. Lifeworkers spread throughout the galaxy, racing against time and the spreading flood infection to save what they could. The Librarian's relationship with humanity demonstrated Lifeworker philosophy at its most controversial and complex. After the human Forerunner War ended, the Council punished humanity severely, forcing them through a process of technological and biological regression that stripped away millennia of advancement. The Librarian questioned this decision, arguing that it was unjust to punish an entire species for actions taken in desperation. Humanity had fought the Forerunners while simultaneously battling the Flood, had lost countless worlds to both conflicts, and had been driven to the edge of extinction before surrendering. But the Librarian saw more in humanity than just victims of Forerunner justice. She recognized potential, a quality she believed made humans special among all sentient species. Against Council orders, she set up a research station on Earth, or as the Forerunners called it, Erde Tyrene. There, she watched over humanity's recovery, guiding their development, ensuring they would eventually reclaim their place among the stars. She planted genetic triggers in human DNA, carefully designed sequences that would activate over tens of thousands of years, preparing humanity for the role she believed they would eventually fulfill. This favoritism toward humanity created tension in the Librarian's own marriage. She was wed to the Didact, the supreme commander of Forerunner military forces and the highest-ranking Promethean in the warrior servant rate. Their marriage represented an unusual union between rates, warrior and life worker, military and medical, power and preservation. For much of their relationship, this difference in perspective strengthened both of them. Warrior pragmatism balanced by healer compassion. But the flood crisis exposed fundamental incompatibilities. The Didact, after years of losing battles and watching the parasite consume world after world, eventually concluded that extreme measures were necessary. When he discovered the Composer, a device that could convert organic beings into digital intelligences immune to flood infection, he saw an opportunity. He began composing human populations, extracting their consciousness, and placing it into mechanical Promethean night bodies. To the Didact, this was salvation, preserving humanity's essence while making them useful soldiers in the war against the flood. To the Librarian, it was horror, the violation of everything she stood for. Humanity wasn't just genetic code to be preserved or consciousness to be uploaded. They were living beings with autonomy and dignity, deserving protection in their natural form. The Composer represented everything the Librarian opposed: the reduction of life to mere data, the sacrifice of autonomy for military utility, the corruption of preservation into exploitation. This disagreement drove a wedge between them that would never fully heal. The Librarian eventually imprisoned the Didact in a cryptum on Requiem, sealing away the warrior she loved to prevent him from continuing his campaign of forced composition. It was an act born of desperate necessity, proof that even the strongest bonds could break under the weight of the flood crisis and the moral compromises it demanded. The evidence suggests she hoped that thousands of years in meditation might heal his corrupted thinking, restore the Didact she had once known. Beyond these dramatic conflicts, Lifeworkers maintained thousands of ongoing projects throughout Forerunner space. They operated medical centers on every major world, providing healthcare not just to Forerunners, but to client species under Ecumene protection. Their hospitals could regenerate lost limbs, repair brain damage, cure diseases that would have been impossible to treat with less advanced technology. Some Lifeworker facilities specialized in extreme interventions, bringing individuals back from states that any other civilization would have called death. The Lifeworker medical philosophy emphasized holistic treatment, understanding patients within their complete biological and social context. They didn't just repair physical damage, but considered psychological health, environmental factors, and long-term quality of life. This comprehensive approach took more time than builders typically had patience for, another source of friction between the rates. Builders wanted fast, efficient solutions. Lifeworkers insisted on careful, thorough care. Research represented the other major pillar of Lifeworker activity. They maintained vast biological databases, cataloging every species they encountered, studying evolutionary processes, investigating how life adapted to different environments. Some Lifeworkers specialized in genetics, mapping genomes and understanding how specific genes produced specific traits. Others focused on ecology, examining how species interacted within complex ecosystems. Still others pursued more theoretical questions about the nature and origin of life itself. This research occasionally produced controversial results. Lifeworker investigations into Forerunner origins revealed uncomfortable truths about their relationship with the precursors, the ancient civilization that preceded them. The precursors had apparently viewed the Forerunners as a disappointment, inferior to humanity, and had planned to strip the Forerunners of the mantle of responsibility. In response, Forerunners had risen up and destroyed the precursors in a war of extermination, an act of genocide that contradicted everything the mantle supposedly represented. Most Forerunners, particularly builders, preferred not to think too deeply about these origins. But Lifeworkers couldn't ignore the implications. If their entire civilization was founded on genocide, if the mantle of responsibility they claimed to uphold had been seized through violence rather than earned through virtue, what did that say about Forerunner moral authority? These questions haunted Lifeworker philosophy, particularly during the flood crisis when their own civilization prepared to commit another act of galactic genocide. The Librarian's conservation measure became the Lifeworkers' all-consuming focus in the final years. Teams deployed throughout the galaxy, often working in conditions of extreme danger as the flood infection spread. They collected specimens from worlds teetering on the edge of consumption, documented cultures hours away from extinction, preserved genetic material from species that would be gone before the day ended. The work was heartbreaking, saving tiny samples while entire civilizations burned. Installation 04, the halo ring discovered centuries later by humanity, held extensive biological preserves established by Lifeworker teams. Each preserve recreated specific environments, from desert ecosystems to tropical forests, housing the indexed species meant to reseed those environments after the array fired. The Librarian personally oversaw much of this work, ensuring that when the time came, life could return to the galaxy in all its diversity. But even as she prepared for survival after the halo activation, the Librarian pursued another objective, one that would take thousands of years to bear fruit. She believed that humanity represented the true inheritors of the mantle, that given time and guidance, they would succeed where the Forerunners had failed. So she planted seeds throughout human DNA, genetic triggers that would activate over millennia, preparing humanity for challenges she could only dimly foresee. These modifications were subtle, carefully designed not to interfere with normal human development, but to provide capabilities that would activate under specific circumstances. Some sequences would enhance cognitive abilities when triggered by certain technologies. Others would provide resistance to specific threats. The Librarian was preparing humanity for a future she wouldn't live to see, gifting them with tools they wouldn't understand for 100,000 years. In the very end, as the flood overwhelmed the last Forerunner positions and the decision to activate the array became imminent, the Librarian remained on Earth. She could have sought safety, could have positioned herself at the Ark beyond the Halo's range. Instead, she stayed with humanity, wanting to guide them through their final moments before the activation and their eventual recovery afterward. She prepared her final messages, locked away her research, and waited for the end with the calm acceptance of someone who had done everything possible to preserve what she loved. When the array fired and the pulse of sterilizing energy washed across Earth, the Librarian met it standing in her research station, surrounded by the species she had dedicated her life to protecting. Her final act was to seal the Didact's cryptum more securely, ensuring he couldn't escape, and threaten the humanity she had worked so hard to preserve. Then the pulse arrived, and the Librarian's biological form dissolved, her consciousness perhaps retreating to the domain, or simply ceasing to exist. The Lifeworkers' legacy outlasted their civilization. The biological preserves they established functioned for 100,000 years, maintaining specimens in perfect stasis. The genetic modifications they made to humanity activated on schedule, providing capabilities when needed. The medical knowledge they recorded influenced countless species who discovered Forerunner facilities and learned from the databases left behind. In a very real sense, the Lifeworkers achieved their goal. Life survived the Halo activation. Diversity was preserved, and the galaxy eventually recovered. But the cost of that survival haunted everything the Lifeworkers stood for. They had prepared the conservation measure, but only as a compromise with those building genocide weapons. They had opposed the Halos morally, but had made them practically viable by ensuring that their activation wouldn't mean permanent extinction. In trying to preserve life, they had enabled its destruction. That contradiction, that terrible moral compromise, defined the Lifeworker rate in its final days. Healers who made killing possible. Preservers who facilitated apocalypse. The warrior servants, glory, decline, and betrayal. The warrior servant rate embodied martial excellence and military tradition, stretching back millions of years into Forerunner history. These were not mere soldiers, but professional warriors in the truest sense. Individuals who dedicated their entire existence to the mastery of combat and the protection of Forerunner civilization. They were strategists and tacticians, commanders and fighters, the shield that stood between the Ecumene and its enemies. Yet by the time the flood returned, the warrior servants found themselves marginalized and politically impotent, victims of a builder-orchestrated campaign that had stripped them of power and influence. This was not how it had always been. In ancient times, warrior servants stood at the apex of Forerunner society. During the era of aggressive expansion, when Forerunners spread throughout the galaxy and encountered countless other species, the warriors held supreme authority. It was a warrior council that governed the Ecumene, warrior commanders who made the critical decisions, warrior philosophy that shaped Forerunner culture. The mantle of responsibility itself bore heavy warrior influence in those days, interpreted through a lens of strength, order, and protective dominance. But as the Ecumene matured and military expansion gave way to consolidation and development, power gradually shifted toward the builders. The construction of megastructures, the expansion of infrastructure, the economic management of 3 million worlds, all these peacetime activities favored builder expertise over warrior prowess. The transition took thousands of years, subtle and seemingly inevitable. But by the time the flood crisis emerged, warriors had become a shadow of their former power. When a Forerunner committed to the warrior servant rite, they underwent dramatic physical transformations. Warriors grew larger and more imposing than other rates, their bodies augmented for combat effectiveness. The mutations enhanced muscle density, increased reflexes, improved sensory acuity, and added redundant organ systems that allowed warriors to survive injuries that would kill others. Some warrior variants developed additional arms for wielding multiple weapons. Others grew heavier skeletal structures to support enhanced musculature. But the physical changes represented only the foundation. Warrior servants received extensive mental conditioning and tactical training. They studied military history spanning millions of years, learning from victories and defeats across thousands of campaigns. They mastered strategy at every scale, from individual combat to fleet actions involving billions of combatants. They learned to lead, to inspire, to make life and death decisions under conditions of chaos and uncertainty. A fully mature warrior servant was a complete military professional, capable of functioning effectively at any level, from squad tactics to theater strategy. The rate included several subdivisions, each with specialized focus. Standard warrior servants formed the bulk of the military, competent professional soldiers who could fight in any environment against any foe. Strikers specialized in rapid assault operations, equipped with light armor and weapons designed for speed and mobility. Sentinels focused on defensive operations, holding positions against overwhelming odds. And at the peak of warrior servant excellence stood the Prometheans. Prometheans represented the absolute elite of Forerunner military capability. To become a Promethean required not just exceptional combat skill, but also philosophical understanding of war's nature and purpose. Prometheans were warrior philosophers, individuals who combined physical prowess with strategic genius and ethical commitment to the mantle of responsibility. There were never many Prometheans, perhaps a few thousand at any given time across the entire Ecumene, but their influence far exceeded their numbers. The most famous Promethean, and arguably the most important warrior servant in Forerunner history, was an individual who held multiple titles. Shadow of Sundered Star was his birth name, though he was known as the Didact, a title indicating supreme military command. He was the Didact, to distinguish him from a younger warrior who later assumed the same title, and he embodied both the nobility and the tragedy of the warrior servant rite. The Didact's career spanned millennia and encompassed some of the most significant military campaigns in Forerunner history. He commanded forces during the Human Forerunner Wars, that 1,000-year conflict that nearly destroyed both civilizations. Humanity at that time possessed technology and capabilities comparable to the Forerunners, and they fought with desperate determination, simultaneously battling the Forerunners while trying to contain a flood outbreak. The war was brutal, consuming worlds and fleets, and the Didact experienced firsthand the costs of prolonged conflict. When the war finally ended with humanity's defeat, the Didact argued for mercy. He recognized that humans had fought not from aggression, but from necessity, trying to contain the flood even as they defended themselves from Forerunner attacks. He respected their tenacity and suggested that humanity should be granted a place within the Ecumene, integrated as valuable allies rather than punished as defeated enemies. This recommendation demonstrated the Didact's strategic wisdom. Humanity possessed qualities that could strengthen Forerunner civilization, but the Council, now dominated by builders, rejected the Didact's counsel. They viewed humanity as dangerous rivals who needed to be neutralized permanently. The punishment they devised was cruel beyond measure. Forced devolution, the reversal of 1,000,000 years of human advancement. Humans were stripped of their technology, their civilization dismantled, their very biology regressed to a more primitive state. They were scattered across primitive worlds, particularly Earth, reduced to hunter-gatherer societies with no memory of their former glory. The Didact witnessed this punishment with growing horror, seeing it as a violation of the Mantle's principles, subjecting an entire species to forced regression wasn't protection or stewardship. It was cruelty, an abuse of power that contradicted everything the Forerunners claimed to believe. This experience began to sour the Didact's relationship with builder-dominated Forerunner government, planting seeds of conflict that would eventually consume his life. The Didact's marriage to the Librarian represented an unusual bond between rates, warrior and life worker, military pragmatism and biological compassion, war and healing united in partnership. For centuries, this combination worked beautifully, each complementing the other's strengths and compensating for their weaknesses. The Librarian's ethical perspective tempered the Didact's warrior instincts. The Didact's strategic thinking gave practical form to the Librarian's ideals. Together, they represented the best of what Forerunner civilization could be. But the flood's return shattered this harmony. As the parasite spread and Forerunner forces suffered defeat after defeat, the Didact's strategic assessment grew increasingly grim. Traditional military responses weren't working. The flood adapted too quickly, learned too fast, exploited every weakness. For every victory warrior servants achieved, the flood came back stronger. Having learned from its defeat, the Didact realized he needed new strategies, new weapons, new approaches to combat an enemy unlike any the Forerunners had faced before. His solution involved shield worlds, massive installations that used dimensional compression to create protected spaces. Unlike the Halo strategy the Builders were pursuing, shield worlds would preserve life, allowing populations to shelter safely until the flood could be contained and eliminated through sustained military campaigns. The Didact proposed constructing millions of shield worlds throughout the galaxy, a defensive network that could protect the Ecumene without requiring the genocide inherent in the Halo approach. The plan was sound, but it had one fatal flaw. It would take too long and cost too much. Shield world construction required enormous resources and decades of work per installation. The Builders, particularly Master Builder Faber, argued that the Forerunners didn't have time for the Didact's defensive strategy. The flood was spreading too quickly. The Ecumene needed a solution that could be implemented immediately and adjusted on the fly. The Halo array offered this flexibility. The conflict between the Didact's Shield World strategy and Faber's Halo strategy became a proxy for the larger power struggle between warriors and builders. For years, the two leaders fought before the council, each presenting evidence and arguments, each trying to convince the other rates to support their approach. The Didact had military expertise and centuries of combat experience on his side. Faber had political connections, control of crucial resources. Ultimately, politics triumphed over expertise. The council sided with Faber, approving the Halo strategy and authorizing construction of the array. The Didact's influence crumbled, his warnings dismissed, his alternative rejected. But he couldn't accept this decision quietly. He continued to oppose the Halos, arguing that building such weapons represented the ultimate abandonment of the mantle of responsibility. How could weapons designed explicitly to commit genocide be justified under any interpretation of protective stewardship? Faber responded to this continued opposition with characteristic builder ruthlessness. He engineered a situation on the planet Jonjer-Calm where the Didact would be discredited and removed from power. When the Sanshayum on that world rebelled, Faber test-fired a Halo installation at their planet, killing millions. He then framed the Didact for this atrocity, manipulating evidence to suggest that the warrior commander had given the order. The council, already tired of the Didact's opposition, accepted this false narrative. The Didact was tried, convicted, and sentenced to exile. But this wasn't simple banishment. Instead, the Didact was sealed in a cryptum, a Forerunner stasis device designed for indefinite imprisonment.
The cryptum was then hidden on a remote world where it would hopefully never be found. The supreme commander of Forerunner military forces, the greatest strategic mind of his generation, was locked away just as the flood crisis entered its most desperate phase. The builders had won their political victory, but at a terrible cost to the Ecumene's military effectiveness. Thousands of years later, toward the end of the Flood War, the Didact was finally released from his imprisonment. He emerged to find his civilization on the brink of extinction, his forces scattered or destroyed, and his warrior servant rate reduced to a fraction of its former strength. The builders had indeed constructed their halo array, and they had concluded that firing the weapons was now inevitable. Everything the Didact had warned about, every consequence he had predicted, had come to pass. But the Didact who emerged from the cryptum was changed. Long exposure to the flood's logic plague, a form of corrupting information warfare, had twisted his thinking. More immediately, his imprisonment had given him years to contemplate the flood threat and search for solutions. He had concluded that the Librarian was wrong, that humanity didn't deserve special protection or eventual inheritance of the mantle. Instead, he believed humans should be composed, their consciousnesses extracted, and placed into mechanical Promethean night bodies immune to flood infection. The composer that could perform this extraction had been discovered in Forerunner ruins, a device of immense power but horrific application. The Didact began using it on human populations, converting millions of people into digital form and implanting them into Promethean bodies. To his corrupted perspective, this was salvation, preserving humanity while creating an army of incorruptible soldiers. He couldn't see, or wouldn't admit, that this mass conversion was itself a form of extinction, destroying the very thing he claimed to preserve. The Didact's campaign brought him into direct conflict with the Librarian, the final break in their relationship. She couldn't accept what he was doing, couldn't watch him violate everything they had once believed in together. The records suggest she hoped that sealing him away might allow time to heal his corrupted thinking, that meditation in the cryptum might restore his sanity. So she made the hardest decision of her life. She returned the Didact to his cryptum, sealing him away again, this time in the shield world called Requiem. It would be another 100,000 years before he escaped, awakened by the human Master Chief in an ironic twist of fate. The broader warrior servant rate suffered its own final tragedy. As the flood overwhelmed Forerunner positions and the decision to fire the halos became inevitable, warriors continued fighting, holding the line against impossible odds, buying time for the conservation measure and other last-minute preparations. They died by the billions, maintaining discipline and honor, even as their civilization collapsed around them. Some warriors, those loyal Prometheans who followed the Didact, underwent composition themselves, willingly submitting to become the first Promethean knights. These warriors chose to sacrifice their physical forms, believing this was necessary to fight the flood effectively. Later, the Didact would compose human populations from Installation 07 to create hundreds of thousands more knights, an act that led to his imprisonment. These mechanical warriors, whether once Forerunner or human, their organic bodies destroyed but their consciousnesses preserved in hard light form, became guardians of Forerunner installations. For 100,000 years, they would patrol Requiem and other facilities, waiting for threats that would never come, until humanity finally arrived. The standard combat platforms used by warrior servants demonstrated the rate's technological sophistication. War sphinxes were massive walker vehicles equipped with inertial suppression fields, making them effectively immune to kinetic weapons. They carried devastatingly powerful particle beam weapons and could deploy smaller weapons systems for close combat. A single war sphinx could level entire cities or engage fleet-scale targets, and skilled warriors could operate them with precision that turned the vehicles into extensions of their own bodies. Seeker platforms provided mobility and reconnaissance, smaller than war sphinxes, but faster and more agile. Combat skins, the standard armor worn by warriors, incorporated powered exoskeletons, energy shields, and integrated weapon systems. These suits could sustain warriors in the vacuum of space, underwater, or in the heart of stellar atmospheres. They enhanced already considerable physical capabilities to superhuman levels, making even a standard warrior servant a match for dozens of unaugmented combatants. The tragedy of the warrior servants was that all their skill, all their tradition, all their honor meant nothing in the face of political maneuvering and existential crisis. They had protected the Forerunners for millions of years, fought countless wars, defended the Ecumene from every external threat, but they couldn't protect their civilization from its own leaders' decisions. When the builders chose genocide over defense, when they marginalized military expertise in favor of political convenience, the warriors could only watch as everything they had dedicated their lives to protecting was destroyed. In the end, the warrior servants' greatest strength became their fatal weakness. They were loyal, disciplined, committed to serving Forerunner civilization, even when that civilization betrayed them. They followed orders, maintained their oaths, fought until death, despite knowing their cause was lost. This honor, this dedication, ensured they would go down with the ship they had spent millions of years defending, true to their purpose to the very last. The Juridicals, law, order, and the illusion of justice. While builders constructed, miners extracted, Lifeworkers preserved, and warriors fought, another rate labored in relative obscurity, maintaining the legal and administrative infrastructure that held Forerunner civilization together. The Juridicals represented law enforcement, investigation, and legal oversight across the Ecumene's 3 million worlds. They were detectives and judges, prosecutors and archivists, the mechanism through which Forerunner society enforced its rules and maintained at least the appearance of justice. The juridical rate ranked lower in social status than builders, miners, or lifeworkers, but their actual power exceeded what their rank suggested. Juridicals possessed extraordinary investigative authority, including the right to examine any Forerunner's personal ancilla, access private records, and question individuals regardless of rate or position. This authority technically extended even to the highest-ranking builders, though in practice, political considerations often limited how aggressively juridicals could pursue investigations into builder misconduct. Juridical forms varied considerably depending on specific function. Standard investigators developed enhanced sensory capabilities, better able to detect deception or perceive subtle evidence. Their minds adapted for pattern recognition, allowing them to process massive amounts of data and identify crucial connections. Some specialized juridicals developed perfect memory, able to recall every detail of everything they witnessed, a capability that made them invaluable as witnesses in legal proceedings. The most distinctive juridicals
were those who served as catalog agents. These individuals represented the rate's primary investigative arm, dispatched throughout the Ecumene to monitor compliance with Forerunner law and document significant events. Catalog agents possessed extensive authority and remarkable capabilities, including direct access to the domain, that vast information repository that stored Forerunner knowledge and history. The catalog agent's connection to the domain gave them advantages other Forerunners lacked. They could instantly retrieve legal precedents, access historical records, or consult technical specifications. This real-time access to essentially all Forerunner knowledge made catalog agents formidable investigators, able to contextualize evidence and identify violations that others might miss. They spoke in distinctive patterns, often referring to themselves in third person and using formal legal terminology that emphasized their official capacity. One catalog agent in particular played a significant role during the final days of Forerunner civilization. This individual, designated simply as Catalog, investigated various incidents during the flood crisis, including builder misconduct, unauthorized weapons testing, and violations of the Mantle's principles. Catalog's investigations brought them into contact with all the major figures of that era: the Didact, the Librarian, Master Builder Faber, and various other rate leaders. The agent's work ensured that detailed records would survive in the domain, preserved for potential future access. Catalog documented builder crimes, including Faber's illegal test firing of Installation 07 at Jonjur-Com, various violations of the Mantle's principles, and the broader failures of Forerunner leadership during the crisis. But there was a profound futility to these investigations. What good were legal proceedings when the entire civilization was collapsing? Who would be prosecuted when all Forerunners would soon be dead? Catalog continued their work with dedication that might have been admirable or might have been tragic denial, documenting crimes even as the civilization that defined those acts as criminal ceased to exist. The juridical rate maintained the domain's legal archives, vast databases of law spanning millions of years. Forerunner legal codes were extraordinarily complex, reflecting millennia of refinement and the challenges of governing an empire containing countless species and cultures. The laws addressed everything from property rights and contract enforcement to environmental regulations and military codes of conduct. Juridicals studied these codes extensively, becoming experts in specific legal domains. But the law also reflected power structures within Forerunner society. Builder-friendly regulations protected construction interests and limited liability for industrial accidents. Laws regarding military conduct restricted warrior servant authority,
while giving builder security forces greater operational freedom. The legal code, for all its supposed objectivity, served to reinforce the existing hierarchy, with builders at the top and everyone else beneath them. Juridicals navigated this reality with varying degrees of integrity. Some accepted that law served power and adjusted their interpretations accordingly, becoming enforcers of builder dominance rather than genuine seekers of justice. Others tried to apply the law honestly, investigating builder crimes as aggressively as they would violations by any other rate. These principled juridicals often found their careers stymied, their investigations blocked by political interference, their findings buried in administrative processes. The master juridical, leader of the rate, theoretically possessed authority to prosecute even the master builder. In practice, this authority was largely theoretical. The political reality of builder dominance meant that serious crimes committed by powerful builders rarely resulted in meaningful consequences. The master juridical could document evidence, file charges, and present cases, but if the council chose not to pursue prosecution, there was little the juridicals could do. This impotence became particularly evident during the flood crisis. Faber's unauthorized Halo test firing killed millions of Sanchium, a clear violation of multiple laws, including those prohibiting weapons of mass destruction from being used without council authorization. Juridical investigations documented the crime thoroughly. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, yet Faber faced no serious consequences because the builder-dominated council chose to treat the incident as an unfortunate accident rather than deliberate mass murder. Similarly, the massacre at the fishing hamlet involved Forerunner forces, including builder security personnel and warrior servants under builder command, killing an entire human population to secure access to the corpse of a great being. This violated laws regarding treatment of client species, unauthorized military action, and basic murder statutes. Juridicals documented what happened, but again, no meaningful prosecution occurred. The political value of what was taken from the hamlet, the corpse of a being related to precursors, outweighed any legal consequences for obtaining it through violence. These failures highlighted the fundamental limitation of law in Forerunner society. It only functioned when those in power allowed it to function. The juridicals could investigate and document, but they couldn't force prosecution of those who controlled the council. The rate existed in an awkward position, theoretically important but practically subordinate to political considerations. Some juridicals served in more specialized capacities. Enforcer units handled physical security and arrest operations, essentially military police with training in both combat and legal procedure. Archivists maintained records systems beyond those stored in the domain, creating redundant backups and ensuring that evidence couldn't be easily erased. Some juridicals specialized in interpreting the mantle of responsibility,
that philosophical framework that supposedly guided all Forerunner actions, determining when specific acts violated or upheld its principles. This interpretation work became particularly challenging during the flood crisis. The decision to build and potentially fire the Halo array clearly violated the mantle as traditionally understood. Weapons designed to commit genocide couldn't be reconciled with a philosophy centered on protecting and nurturing life. Yet the builders argued that the halos represented the only way to ultimately protect life from the flood. That temporary extinction followed by reseeding was preferable to permanent extinction through flood consumption. Juridicals tasked with evaluating this argument faced an impossible dilemma. By strict interpretation of the mantle, the halos were violations of fundamental principles, but by pragmatic assessment of available options, the halos might represent the least bad choice among terrible alternatives. Different juridicals reached different conclusions, and this disagreement reflected broader Forerunner society's inability to find consensus on how to respond to existential crisis. As the flood overwhelmed more and more Forerunner territory, juridical operations became increasingly difficult. Then came a catastrophic blow. The flood captured several juridicals and used them to access the juridical network. Through this breach, the parasite's logic plague spread to catalog agents and their ancillas, corrupting the very systems designed to maintain legal order. Around 97,445 BCE, the juridical rate was effectively shut down. Legal proceedings throughout the Ecumene put on indefinite hold. Courts couldn't function when the investigators themselves might be compromised. The careful documentation and evidence collection that defined juridical work lost purpose when the records themselves could no longer be trusted. Yet many juridicals continued their duties to the end. They documented the flood's advance, recorded the final days of consumed worlds, investigated incidents even as civilization collapsed. This dedication might have reflected deep commitment to principle, or it might have been simpler than that. The juridicals did what they had always done because they didn't know what else to do. When your entire existence has been defined by maintaining order and documenting truth, you continue those activities even when order has become impossible and truth has become unbearable. The catalog agent who documented the final years provided one of the most complete records of the flood crisis's end. This individual was present at Installation 00 as the decision to fire the Halo array was finalized. Catalog documented the debates, the arguments, the desperate search for alternatives that might avoid the genocide the Forerunners were preparing to commit. The agent recorded the Librarian's final actions, the Didact's imprisonment, and Master Builder Faber's sacrifice at the Greater Ark. When the array fired, and the pulse of sterilizing energy washed across the galaxy, Catalog's biological form was destroyed, like all other sentient life. But the records survived in the domain, preserved for any future civilization that might access that repository. The agent's dedication ensured that the truth of what happened, the crimes committed, and the decisions made
would not be lost entirely. Whether anyone would ever read those records or learn from them remained unknown. The juridical rate's legacy is one of well-intentioned ineffectiveness, of a system designed to maintain justice that ultimately couldn't function when those it was meant to hold accountable controlled the mechanisms of accountability. They documented everything, but changed nothing. They investigated thoroughly, but prosecuted rarely. They upheld law in theory while watching it be violated in practice. The Juridicals represented the rule of law in a civilization that ultimately proved lawless when survival was at stake. Interrate dynamics, marriage, conflict, and assimilation. The Forerunner rate system created specialized excellence, but also generated tensions that shaped their civilization's politics and culture. Rates weren't merely professional categories, they were identities, communities with distinct cultures, philosophies, and interests. Interactions between rates ranged from cooperative partnerships to hostile rivalries, and these dynamics played crucial roles in determining how the Forerunners responded to challenges, particularly the existential crisis posed by the Flood. Marriage between rates was possible, but relatively uncommon, requiring individuals to bridge significant cultural and philosophical differences. The most famous inter-rate marriage in Forerunner history was that of the Didact and the Librarian, warrior servant and lifeworker, military commander and biological preserver. Their relationship demonstrated both the potential and the pitfalls of rate-crossing unions. The early years of their marriage represented an ideal partnership. The Didact's strategic military mind complemented the Librarian's deep understanding of biology and ecology. His warrior pragmatism balanced her compassionate idealism. Together, they represented a complete perspective on the mantle of responsibility, combining protection through strength with nurturing through preservation. They advised the Council jointly on matters ranging from military strategy to treatment of client species. But the Flood crisis exposed fundamental incompatibilities rooted in their rate identities. The Didact, shaped by warrior-servant culture emphasizing discipline, sacrifice, and hard choices, could compartmentalize the horror of what needed to be done. When he concluded that composing humans into mechanical knights was necessary,
pursued that course, despite its moral implications. The Librarian, guided by life-worker principles of respecting life's autonomy and preserving natural forms, couldn't accept this violation. To her, composition was worse than death, a destruction of the very thing it claimed to preserve. Their conflict culminated in the Librarian's decision to imprison the Didact in a cryptum, effectively betraying their marriage to protect the values she held more fundamental than their partnership. It was a tragedy in the classical sense. Two people who genuinely loved each other torn apart by irreconcilable differences rooted in their rate identities. Neither was wrong exactly, but neither could compromise without abandoning core principles their rate transformation had made fundamental to their identity. Other inter-rate marriages faced similar challenges. Builders who married miners might clash over resource allocation priorities, builders wanting materials directed toward prestigious projects, while miners preferred sustainable extraction practices. Warriors married to Juridicals might disagree about proper rules of engagement,
warriors viewing legal restrictions as dangerous constraints, while Juridicals insisted that law must apply even in combat. These conflicts rarely destroyed relationships as dramatically as the Didact and Librarian split, but they created constant low-level tension. The political relationship between builders and warrior servants represented the most consequential rate conflict in late Forerunner civilization. This rivalry stretched back thousands of years, rooted in a fundamental power transition. Warriors had once ruled the Ecumene during its expansionist phase, when military conquest defined Forerunner civilization's trajectory. But as the empire matured and shifted focus from expansion to development, builders gradually displaced warriors as the dominant rate. This transition occurred through both natural evolution and deliberate builder manipulation. As more Forerunner effort went into construction and infrastructure rather than military campaigns, builder expertise became more valuable than warrior prowess. The council's composition shifted toward builders and builder-aligned rates. Builder control of crucial technologies like slipspace drives gave them economic leverage, and builders proved more skilled than warriors at political maneuvering, using alliances and careful manipulation to accumulate power. Warriors resented this displacement intensely. Their rate had protected Forerunner civilization for millions of years, earning dominance through service and sacrifice. The builders had simply waited for peacetime conditions to favor their skills, then used political schemes to seize power warriors had won through blood. From the warrior perspective, builders were opportunistic usurpers who had never faced serious combat, but now made military decisions through council votes. Builders viewed the situation differently. They saw warriors as relics of a more primitive age, useful for security operations, but unfit to govern a sophisticated technological civilization. Military thinking, with its emphasis on discipline, hierarchy, and force, wasn't appropriate for managing complex economic and social systems. Warriors had their place, but that place was in the fleet, not the council chamber. Builders had earned their leadership through competence and results. This mutual contempt shaped how both rates responded to the flood crisis. When warriors proposed the Shield World strategy, builders opposed it partly on practical grounds, cost and timeline, but also from reflexive political resistance. Accepting the warrior plan would have acknowledged warrior superiority in strategic thinking, something builder pride couldn't tolerate. Similarly, when builders proposed the Halo strategy, warriors opposed it partly from genuine moral concern, but also from resentment at builder arrogance in believing they could engineer solutions to problems warriors understood more deeply. The council served as the arena where these rate conflicts played out. This governing body included representatives from all major rates, but builder dominance meant their interests usually prevailed. The master builder held enormous influence, often able to shape council decisions through control of resources and alliances with other rate leaders. The Life Shaper and other rate leaders could influence decisions, but they rarely commanded the voting blocks that builders could mobilize. The council's decision-making process reflected rate hierarchies in subtle ways. Builders spoke first in most debates, framing issues in terms favorable to their interests. Warriors spoke later, forced to respond to builder arguments rather than setting the agenda. Votes often split along rate lines, with builders and their minor allies on one side, warriors and sometimes lifeworkers on the other, and juridicals attempting to mediate or provide legal guidance. During the flood crisis, these political dynamics proved catastrophic. Critical decisions about strategy, resource allocation, and ultimately the fate of the galaxy were made not through careful analysis of military and scientific evidence, but through rate politics. The Council approved the Halo array partly because builders wanted it, not because it was necessarily the best option. They marginalized the Didact partly because he threatened builder dominance, not solely because his strategy was flawed. Some rates disappeared entirely during Forerunner history, absorbed by others in processes called rate assimilation. The Theoreticals, who had specialized in pure scientific research and theoretical physics, were forcibly merged into the builder rate thousands of years before the flood crisis. Builders argued that theoretical research needed closer integration with practical applications, that having a separate rate for scientists created inefficiency. The real motivation was
Probably simpler. Theoreticals were developing sufficient prestige and influence to threaten builder dominance, so the builders eliminated them as a distinct political entity. The assimilation process involved more than just administrative reorganization. Theoreticals who wanted to continue their research had to formally join the builder rate, undergoing additional mutations to align their physical forms with builder standards. Many refused, choosing to abandon their work rather than submit to builder control. Those who did join found themselves treated as junior builders, their theoretical expertise valuable, but subordinate to builder engineering priorities. Within a few generations, distinct theoretical culture and identity had been effectively erased. The Weavers suffered similar fate. This rate had specialized in storytelling, cultural preservation, and artistic expression, maintaining Forerunner myths and histories through oral tradition and performance. Builders deemed this function redundant given the domain's existence as a comprehensive information repository. Why maintain an entire rate to tell stories when those stories could simply be stored digitally? So the Weavers were absorbed, their cultural role eliminated, their members forced to join other rates or accept marginalization. These assimilations demonstrated the rate system's flexibility and its brutality. Rates weren't eternal categories but evolved based on political and practical considerations. If a rate became inconvenient or threatened existing power structures, it could be eliminated through assimilation. The process was presented as rational streamlining, but it was also a tool of political control, a way for dominant rates to eliminate potential rivals. Engineers represented a rate that survived but occupied an ambiguous position. These Forerunners specialized in maintaining and repairing technology, from simple mechanical systems to complex slipspace engines. They ranked below all the major rates, essentially technicians rather than true professionals. Yet their expertise was crucial, and without engineers, Forerunner technology would have gradually degraded into uselessness. The rate persisted not through political power but through practical necessity. Engineer mutations were among the most extensive, transforming their bodies into living tools. Many engineers developed additional appendages specialized for specific tasks: microscopic manipulators for circuit-level repairs, magnetic organs for working with powered systems,
sensory capabilities that allowed them to perceive electromagnetic fields or detect structural stress. Some engineers merged so thoroughly with the technology they maintained that the boundary between flesh and machine became unclear. The relationship between rates and the domain deserves particular attention. This vast repository of Forerunner knowledge and consciousness wasn't equally accessible to all rates. Juridicals, particularly cataloged agents, had privileged access due to their official investigative functions. Builders enjoyed extensive access to technical specifications and historical construction records. Lifeworkers could retrieve biological data and medical research. Warriors accessed military histories and tactical databases. But access wasn't the same as contribution. The domain accumulated knowledge from all Forerunners, absorbing their experiences, memories, and discoveries upon death. Yet the domain also reflected rate hierarchies in subtle ways. Builder contributions received more prominent indexing. Warrior histories were categorized as military records rather than general history. Lifeworker ethical arguments were filed under philosophy rather than practical policy. The domain was supposed to be an objective repository, but it encoded the same power structures that shaped physical Forerunner society. During the flood crisis, rate dynamics shifted in complex ways. The immediate threat forced some degree of cooperation as survival trumped political maneuvering. Warriors and builders coordinated military operations despite their mutual hostility. Lifeworkers worked with miners to establish biological preserves despite philosophical differences about life's value. Juridicals documented everything, creating records that might outlast the civilization they chronicled. But cooperation had limits. Fundamental rate identities persisted even under existential pressure. Builders continued pursuing technological solutions, constructing ever larger weapons and defenses. Warriors advocated for direct military engagement, seeking honor in combat even when victory was impossible. Lifeworkers focused on preservation, trying to save what they could from the approaching apocalypse. Juridicals maintained legal proceedings, investigating crimes that would never be prosecuted because everyone involved would soon be dead. These rate-based responses meant the Forerunners never achieved truly unified strategy against the flood. They fought as a collection of specialized factions, each pursuing their rate's characteristic solution, rather than as a cohesive civilization with integrated approach. The builders built weapons. The warriors fought battles. The lifeworkers preserved samples. The juridicals documented failures. Each rate did what their identity demanded, but no overarching coordination emerged to synthesize these efforts into comprehensive strategy. The question of whether children inherited their parents' rates or chose independently produced different answers at different periods of Forerunner history. In ancient times, rate membership was often hereditary. Children of builders becoming builders themselves, continuing family traditions spanning millions of years. But during later eras, young Forerunners called manipulars had more choice, though social pressure and practical considerations still heavily influenced decisions. A manipular born to builder parents would grow up
immersed in builder culture, learning builder values, studying builder achievements. When the time came for rate selection and mutation, choosing anything other than builder would mean rejecting family, abandoning familiar community, starting over in a rate where they had no connections or cultural familiarity. Most chose the path of least resistance, following their parents into the same rate.
true rate mobility was theoretically possible, but practically rare. This quasi-hereditary system reinforced rate divisions across generations. Builder families accumulated wealth and political connections over thousands of years, passing these advantages to their builder children. Warrior servant families maintained military traditions and combat techniques through generational teaching. Lifeworker families developed specialized knowledge about specific species or ecosystems. The rates became increasingly distinct communities, almost separate peoples sharing only their forerunner biology and allegiance to the Ecumene. Inter-rate adoption was possible but unusual. If parents died or were otherwise unable to raise their children, manipulars might be taken in by families from different rates. These adopted children faced difficult choices when selection time arrived: honor their birth parents' rate or join their adoptive family's rate. Some chose birth rate, maintaining connection to dead parents. Others chose adoptive rate, recognizing the practical benefits of staying with their actual caregivers. Either choice involved loss. The physical distinctions between rates became more pronounced over Forerunner history as mutations accumulated. Early Forerunners of different rates looked relatively similar, their variations subtle, but millions of years of selective mutation amplified differences until rates appeared almost as distinct species. A fully mature builder with forearms and enhanced spatial reasoning organs looked dramatically different from a massive warrior servant with redundant combat organs, who in turn bore little resemblance to a graceful, floating life worker. These physical differences reinforced social divisions. You could identify someone's rate instantly by appearance, which meant you knew their social status, likely attitudes, professional expertise, and political alignments before any conversation occurred. The rate system wasn't just administrative organization, but visible hierarchy, literally carved into flesh through mutation. Social inequality became biological reality, and biological reality justified social inequality in a self-reinforcing cycle. Some Forerunners questioned this system, wondering if specialization had gone too far, if the rates had become too distinct to maintain true civilization unity. These doubts rarely found public expression, because the rate system was so fundamental to Forerunner society that criticizing it seemed almost incomprehensible. But private journals and domain entries revealed that some individuals, particularly those in inter-rate marriages or adopted into different rates, recognized the system's limitations. The flood crisis proved these doubts prophetic. When flexibility and adaptation were most needed, the rate system enforced rigid specialization. When unified response would have been most effective, rate identities promoted fragmented approaches. When cooperation could have maximized survival chances, rate rivalries ensured suboptimal decision-making. The system that had worked for millions of years during prosperity and expansion became a fatal weakness during existential crisis. The mutation process, becoming your function. At the heart of the Forerunner rate system lay a transformation process that modern humanity can barely imagine: the deliberate, controlled mutation of the Forerunner body to match specific functional requirements. This wasn't cosmetic modification or simple augmentation. It was fundamental restructuring at genetic, cellular, and organ system levels, transforming a generic young forerunner called a manipular into a specialized adult member of a particular rate. Understanding this process is crucial to understanding why the rate system created such rigid divisions, and why those divisions proved so difficult to overcome. Young forerunners spent their early decades in a state called manipular, a form not yet committed to any rate. Manipulars were smaller than adult forerunners, less specialized, capable of learning and adapting but not yet physically optimized for any particular function. They studied general knowledge, explored different rate cultures, and ideally made informed decisions about which rate to join. In practice, as we've discussed, family pressure and social circumstances heavily influenced these choices. The mutation ceremony marked the transition from manipular to rate-specific adult form. These ceremonies varied by rate, reflecting different cultural traditions and practical requirements. Builder mutations emphasized enhancement of manipulative abilities and spatial reasoning. Minor mutations prepared bodies for extreme environments and physical stress. Lifeworker mutations developed precision and sensory acuity. Warrior servant mutations maximized combat effectiveness and physical resilience. The process began with genetic analysis, scanning the manipular's DNA to identify optimal mutation pathways. Forerunner genetics were incredibly sophisticated, featuring deliberate design elements that suggested they might not be entirely natural species. Whether the precursors had engineered them or they had modified themselves over millions of years remained unclear. But Forerunner genomes contained latent capabilities that could be activated through proper stimulation. Once mutation pathways were identified, the manipular underwent a series of treatments over months or years. Gene therapies altered DNA in specific cell lines, activating dormant capabilities or introducing new genetic information.
Biochemical treatments triggered accelerated growth in certain organs while inhibiting others. Nanoscale machines might be introduced to reshape bone structure or modify neural pathways. The exact process varied by rate and individual, but the result was always the same: comprehensive transformation of the Forerunner body. The physical changes could be dramatic. A manipular selecting the builder rate might grow 2 additional arms over the course of a year, bone and muscle and nerve developing according to carefully controlled patterns. Their brain would expand in regions associated with spatial visualization, adding processing capacity for complex 3-dimensional calculations. Their eyes might develop additional structures, allowing perception of architectural stress indicators or material composition. Warrior servant mutations were even more extensive. The growing Forerunner would gain significant height and mass, their frame expanding to support enhanced musculature. Bones would thicken and incorporate structures that distributed impact force more effectively. Redundant organs would develop. Hearts and lungs and filtration systems duplicated, so that damage to one system wouldn't be immediately fatal. The nervous system would accelerate, improving reflex speeds to levels unmatched by other rates. Lifeworker mutations took different directions. Rather than size or strength, these changes emphasized precision and perception. manipulators, the hands and fingers, would develop extraordinary fine motor control, capable of manipulating tools at microscopic scales. Sensory organs would expand their range, perceiving biological processes through thermal signatures, electromagnetic emissions, or chemical traces. Some lifeworkers developed flight-capable forms, their bones hollowing and their bodies lightening until they could hover through controlled field generation. The neurological changes accompanying physical mutations were equally important. Rate-specific cognitive enhancements shaped how forerunners of different rates thought and perceived. Builders developed intuitive understanding of structural engineering, able to visualize architectural solutions almost automatically. Warriors gained combat instincts, tactical pattern recognition that operated faster than conscious thought. Lifeworkers achieved empathic connection with living systems, understanding biological needs and responses at unconscious levels. These mental modifications meant that rates didn't just do different work, but actually thought differently. A builder encountering a problem instinctively conceptualized engineering solutions. A warrior viewed situations through tactical frameworks. A lifeworker considered biological implications first. The mutations didn't prevent understanding other perspectives, but they made certain types of thinking more natural and others requiring more effort. The irreversibility of these changes cannot be overstated. Once mutation was complete, Forerunner's body had been permanently altered. Attempting to reverse the process or mutate again toward a different rate would likely result in death or catastrophic dysfunction. The mutations weren't simple additions that could be removed, but fundamental restructurings that affected every system. You couldn't unmake a builder into a warrior any more than you could rebuild a house into a bridge while people still lived inside. This permanence gave the rate selection enormous psychological weight. Choosing a rate meant committing to a specific identity for the rest of your life, which for forerunners could span thousands of years. Young manipulars understood that their decision would define not just their career, but their body, their mind, their social position, and their cultural identity. It's no wonder that most chose the path already laid out by family and circumstance, rather than striking out toward unfamiliar rates. The mutation process also included social and cultural components. As manipulars underwent physical transformation, they participated in rate-specific training and education. Builder initiates learned the prayers and rituals of their rate, memorizing ancestor names and studying symbolic systems. Warrior initiates underwent discipline training and combat instruction, beginning to internalize the code of honor their rate upheld. These social aspects reinforced the physical changes, creating complete rate identity that integrated body, mind, and culture. Different rates organized their members into additional hierarchical subdivisions. Builders divided into forms, guilds, and maniples. Forms represented broad specializations within the builder rate, such as architectural design, weapons construction, or slipspace engineering. Guilds were professional organizations within forms, grouping builders who worked on similar projects. Maniples were social units, almost like extended families, builders bound by formal relationships of mentorship, loyalty, and mutual obligation. Warriors organized into similar structures. Forms distinguished between standard warrior servants, specialized assault troops, defensive specialists, and the elite Prometheans.
Guilds connected warriors who served in similar capacities or operated particular types of equipment. Warrior maniples were particularly important, forming tight-knit combat units whose members trained together for centuries and developed near-telepathic coordination. These internal subdivisions created additional complexity within the rate system. It wasn't enough to be a builder. You were a specific kind of builder within a particular guild and maniple. These affiliations carried their own status hierarchies and political implications. A builder from a prestigious guild working on high-profile projects occupied very different social position than a builder from minor guild doing maintenance work, even though both were technically the same rate. The mutation process occasionally produced
unexpected results. Sometimes the genetic analysis miscalculated, or the treatments interacted in unforeseen ways, or the individual Forerunner's biology responded unpredictably. These mutation failures could be minor, producing slight variations from standard rate form, or catastrophic, resulting in non-viable development that required extensive medical intervention or even proved fatal. Forerunners who survived mutation failures but developed non-standard forms occupied ambiguous social positions. They belonged to their rate, technically, but might not possess all the physical capabilities other rate members enjoyed. Some found ways to compensate, developing alternative approaches that allowed them to fulfill their rate's functions, despite atypical bodies. Others faced discrimination or were relegated to less demanding roles within their rate. The rate system, despite its sophistication, had difficulty accommodating deviation from established norms. As Forerunners aged, their rate-specific forms could undergo additional changes. Some mutations developed more fully over time, with capabilities that wouldn't manifest until centuries after initial transformation. Other changes represented natural evolution of the rate-specific form, bodies continuing to optimize themselves for their designated functions. Ancient Forerunners who had spent thousands of years in their rate often bore little resemblance to recently mutated members of the same rate, their forms having evolved far beyond the standard template. The Didact represented an extreme example of this progression. As an ancient Promethean who had lived for thousands of years, his warrior servant form had developed far beyond normal specifications. He stood nearly 4 meters tall, massing far more than standard warriors, his body incorporating mutation adaptations that accumulated over his long life. His combat capabilities exceeded what newer warriors could achieve, because his form had been refining itself for millennia. He represented what a warrior servant could become given enough time and experience. Similarly, the Librarian's Lifeworker form had evolved over her long life. She had developed capabilities that younger Lifeworkers lacked, intuitive understanding of biological systems that came only from thousands of years studying life. Her body had adapted to her work, becoming more perfectly suited to biological manipulation and preservation. She was recognizably Lifeworker, but represented the rate's potential taken to extraordinary heights. These ancient, highly developed Forerunners sometimes seemed almost as different from recently mutated rate members as different rates were from each other. Time and experience created a vertical hierarchy within rates that paralleled the horizontal hierarchy between rates. Young warriors deferred to ancient Prometheans. Junior builders acknowledged senior master builders. The rate system created multiple overlapping hierarchies, all reinforced physical differences that made status immediately visible. The psychological impact of mutation extended beyond the immediate physical changes. Knowing that your body had been deliberately shaped to fulfill a specific function created deep sense of purpose and identity, but also potentially stifling limitation. You weren't just choosing a career, you were literally becoming your job. Your flesh embodied your social role. Escaping or changing that role meant rejecting your own body, a level of alienation difficult for most Forerunners to contemplate. Some philosophers questioned whether the mutation process violated individual autonomy, whether transforming young Forerunners into specialized forms before they could fully understand the implications constituted a kind of violation. These ethical concerns never gained serious traction because the rate system was so embedded in Forerunner civilization that imagining alternatives proved nearly impossible. Mutation was simply what Forerunners did, as natural and inevitable as aging, not something to be questioned or resisted. The process also raised questions about identity and continuity. Was a manipular the same person after mutation? They retained their memories and personality, but their body, their capabilities, even their thinking patterns had been fundamentally altered. Philosophers debated whether mutation created a new person who remembered being the manipular, or truly transformed the same person into a new form. The question had no definitive answer, but it troubled some Forerunners who experienced the transformation and found themselves wondering if they were still entirely themselves. In the end, the mutation process represented both the brilliance and the tragedy of Forerunner civilization. They had mastered biology to the point where they could deliberately reshape themselves, optimizing their bodies for specific functions with incredible precision. This specialization enabled extraordinary achievements, megastructures, and technologies that required the precise capabilities different rates provided. But that same specialization created rigid divisions that prevented adaptation when circumstances demanded flexibility, ultimately contributing to their civilization's fall. The fall and legacy, how rigidity bred extinction. The Forerunner rate system, perfected over millions of years and responsible for countless achievements, ultimately contributed to the civilization's extinction. Understanding this collapse requires examining how the system's greatest strengths became fatal weaknesses when the flood returned, and how the rigid specialization that enabled wonder made adaptation impossible when survival demanded change. The flood presented a challenge fundamentally different from anything the rate system was designed to handle. Previous threats had been conventional: rival species to be defeated militarily, resources to be managed economically, social problems to be resolved administratively. The rate system worked beautifully for these conventional challenges. Warriors fought enemies, builders constructed defenses, miners provided materials, Lifeworkers treated wounded, Juridicals maintained order. Each rate fulfilled its function, and together they managed whatever problems arose. But the flood didn't respect functional divisions. It was simultaneously a military threat requiring warrior expertise, a biological crisis demanding lifeworker knowledge, an existential challenge that tested juridical concepts of law and justice, and an engineering problem that pushed builder capabilities to their limits. No single rate possessed all the expertise needed to combat it effectively.
The situation demanded integrated response, drawing on all rates' knowledge simultaneously. The rate system made such integration nearly impossible. Each rate approached the flood through their specialized lens, proposing solutions that reflected their rate identity, rather than comprehensive strategic assessment. Warriors wanted to fight directly, engaging the flood in military campaigns they understood how to conduct. Builders wanted to engineer solutions, constructing weapons and defenses. Lifeworkers wanted to research biological countermeasures, finding ways to immunize against infection. Juridicals wanted to document everything, ensuring knowledge survived even if civilization didn't. None of these approaches were wrong exactly, but none were sufficient alone, and the rate system prevented effective synthesis. When the council met to determine strategy, rate representatives advocated for their rates solutions, lobbied for resources to be allocated to their rates projects, defended their rates' institutional interests. The political dynamics that had always shaped council deliberations continued, even as the civilization faced extinction. Rate rivalries and status competitions persisting when unity was most needed. The conflict between builder and warrior strategies exemplified this dysfunction. The shield world approach the Didact proposed represented genuine strategic innovation, a way to preserve Forerunner civilization while containing the flood through long-term military pressure. The Halo strategy Faber championed offered quicker implementation and more certain results, though at the cost of committing genocide. Both strategies had merit. An objective assessment might have concluded that both should be pursued simultaneously. Shield worlds as primary defense and Halos as last resort backup. But objective assessment didn't happen because builder-warrior rivalry prevented it. Builders opposed shield worlds partly because accepting the warrior plan would validate warrior strategic thinking and potentially restore warrior political influence. Warriors opposed Halos partly because the builder plan represented everything they despised about builder culture: technological arrogance, willingness to violate moral principles for expedience, and assumption that
engineering could solve problems that required military expertise. Rate identity turned strategy into politics, and politics into disaster. The marginalization of warrior servants proved particularly catastrophic. The Forerunners faced an unprecedented military crisis, yet they systematically weakened their military leadership because warriors threatened builder political dominance. The exile of the Didact removed the most experienced military commander at precisely the moment his expertise was most needed. The disbanding of warrior fleets and subordination of military forces to builder security command created confused chains of authority and inefficient resource allocation. Imagine if modern humanity, facing an existential military threat, decided to disband its military and place defense in the hands of civilian construction companies because those companies had better political connections. That's essentially what the Forerunners did, and the results were predictably disastrous. Builder security forces lacked the combat experience, tactical sophistication, and strategic depth that dedicated warriors had developed over millions of years. They could garrison installations and patrol trade routes, but couldn't fight the sophisticated campaigns the flood required. The Lifeworkers' isolation from decision-making created similar problems. They possessed
deep understanding of biological systems, expertise directly relevant to combating a parasitic organism. Yet the Builder-dominated council treated Lifeworker input as ethical objection to be managed rather than technical analysis to be incorporated. The Librarian's warnings about the Halo strategy were framed as moral squeamishness rather than recognition that genocide weapons represented strategic failure. Her expertise in biology, which might have contributed to finding weaknesses in flood infection mechanisms, went largely unexploited because Lifeworkers were expected to preserve samples, not shape military strategy. Even the successful aspects of the Forerunner response reflected rate system limitations. The conservation measure, that vast project to preserve life before the Halo activation, was brilliant in conception and execution. Lifeworkers worked for years cataloging species, collecting samples, preparing for reseeding. But the project only became necessary because the Forerunners had committed to a strategy that required killing everything. If the rate system had allowed more flexible thinking, if builders had been willing to fully resource the Shield World strategy, if warriors had retained sufficient political influence to shape overall strategic direction, perhaps the conservation measure wouldn't have been needed at all. The domain's corruption by the flood's logic plague demonstrated another rate-based failure. The domain was supposed to be secure, an inviolable repository of all Forerunner knowledge, but it had been designed primarily by builders and juridicals, specialists in
technology and record keeping, but not security against sophisticated information warfare. Warriors who understood combat in all its forms, including psychological and informational dimensions, might have built better defenses. Lifeworkers who understood parasitic manipulation of host systems might have anticipated how the flood could corrupt informational substrates. But the domain's architecture reflected the rate system's hierarchical structure. Builders had privileged access because they controlled council resources. Juridicals had special access because they maintained legal archives. Warriors and Lifeworkers had more limited access, appropriate to their supposedly narrower needs. This tiered access created vulnerabilities that the flood exploited, using compromised accounts to spread its logic plague through the supposedly secure network. A more egalitarian information architecture, one that didn't encode rate hierarchies into access privileges, might have been more resilient. The speed with which Forerunner civilization collapsed once the flood gained momentum revealed how dependent the entire structure was on each rate fulfilling its function. When the flood consumed worlds faster than miners could extract resources, builder construction projects stalled for lack of materials. When builder installations fell to flood attack, warriors lost the logistical support they needed for sustained campaigns. When Lifeworker research centers were overrun, medical support for combat forces disappeared. When juridical records were corrupted, crucial intelligence and historical knowledge became unreliable. The rate system created a civilization of extraordinary capability, but also extraordinary fragility. Each rate depended on the others functioning properly, and disruption of any rate cascaded through the entire system. The Forerunners had optimized for efficiency during peacetime, but had created dependencies that became critical vulnerabilities during existential crisis.
A more redundant system, where different rates maintained overlapping capabilities, would have been less efficient but more resilient. Some individual Forerunners recognized these problems and attempted to transcend their rate limitations. The Librarian worked with warriors despite being Lifeworker. Some builders supported the Shield World strategy despite rate loyalty pressuring them toward the Halo approach. Catalog continued investigating builder crimes despite political pressure to cease. But these individual acts of integrity couldn't overcome systemic dysfunction. The rate system was too embedded, too fundamental to Forerunner civilization to be reformed while that civilization faced extinction. The final decision to activate the Halo array represented total rate system failure. This wasn't strategy in any meaningful sense, but admission that the Forerunners couldn't solve the flood problem through conventional means. Every rate had failed. Warriors couldn't defeat the flood.
Militarily, builders couldn't construct defenses that held. Lifeworkers couldn't develop biological countermeasures. Juridicals couldn't maintain order as society collapsed. The only option remaining was to press the reset button, kill everything, and hope the reseeded civilizations would do better. The firing of the array killed every Forerunner not shielded at the Ark or in other protected locations. The rates ceased to exist as functional organizations. The accumulated knowledge of millions of years stored partly in the domain, but also in living practitioners, vanished. The cultural traditions, the mutations, the specialized expertise, all gone in the pulse of sterilizing energy that washed across the galaxy. The rate system, which had defined Forerunner civilization for its entire history, died with that civilization. But elements survived. The array itself, along with the Ark facilities and various shield worlds, remained operational. The preserves containing indexed species waited in stasis. Some Forerunners, those few who survived at installation sites or were transformed into Promethean knights, persisted in one form or another, and the domain, damaged by the flood's logic plague and shut down by the array's activation, retained its records, dormant but potentially recoverable. When humanity finally encountered these Forerunner remnants, 30 millennia after the array's firing, they found a civilization frozen at the moment of its death. The installations still reflected rate specialization, builder construction methods, Lifeworker biological preserves, warrior weapons systems, juridical documentation protocols. Human researchers studying Forerunner facilities could identify which rate had been primarily responsible for different installations' design and function. The rate system, though its members were long dead, still shaped the archaeology humans discovered. The Covenant's religion, which worshipped Forerunners as gods and sought to activate the Halo array, ironically demonstrated complete misunderstanding of why the Forerunners had built those weapons. The Covenant saw the array as divine instruments of transcendence, believing activation would elevate all believers to godhood. They didn't understand that the Halos were weapons of desperate last resort, built by a civilization that had exhausted all other options and chosen genocide over defeat. The Covenant religion reflected the grandeur of Forerunner technology while remaining ignorant of the tragedy that technology represented. Humanity's relationship with Forerunner legacy proved complex. The genetic modifications the Librarian had planted in human DNA activated over tens of thousands of years, preparing humanity for their role as reclaimers, inheritors of the mantle of responsibility. When humans like John 117 interfaced with Forerunner systems, those systems recognized them as authorized reclaimers and provided access that other species couldn't achieve. The Librarian's vision that humanity would succeed where Forerunners failed began to seem prophetic. But humanity also faced temptations to repeat Forerunner mistakes. The Didact, awakened from his cryptum by Master Chief, immediately resumed his campaign to compose humans into Promethean knights. Some Forerunner technologies, particularly military systems, offered power that humans might misuse as destructively as Forerunners had. The rate system itself, while not directly replicable by humanity, illustrated dangers in extreme specialization and rigid social hierarchies. Humanity had opportunities to learn from Forerunner failures, or to repeat them with equal catastrophic results. The ultimate legacy of the Forerunner rate system is ambiguous. It enabled a civilization to achieve wonders, construct megastructures that spanned galaxies, develop technologies that seemed like magic, govern an empire of 3 million worlds for millions of years. These accomplishments deserve recognition as perhaps the greatest achievements in galactic history. But the same system that enabled those achievements prevented the flexibility and adaptation needed to survive existential crisis. The rates created specialists so specialized they couldn't function outside their narrow domains. And when survival required transcending those domains, the civilization simply couldn't adapt. Was the rate system inevitable? Could the Forerunners have organized themselves differently? These questions can't be answered definitively. Perhaps any civilization advanced enough to build halo rings would develop comparable specialization. And perhaps any such civilization would face similar difficulties adapting that specialization to unprecedented challenges. Or perhaps the Forerunners' particular choices, their specific implementation of rate divisions, created unnecessary rigidity that alternative systems might have avoided. What remains clear is that the Forerunner rate system stands as both inspiration and warning. It demonstrates what organized, specialized effort can achieve when millions work together toward common goals, each contributing their unique expertise. But it also reveals how social divisions, even those based on practical, functional differences, can become unbridgeable chasms that prevent cooperation when unity becomes essential. The Forerunners built monuments that lasted 100,000 years, but the system that built those monuments couldn't save the builders themselves. Conclusion: the weight of specialization. We've traveled tonight through 100,000 years into the past, exploring a civilization so advanced it could construct artificial worlds,
and weapons that could sterilize galaxies. We've examined the Forerunner rate system from every angle. The builders who designed their greatest works and wielded political power with ruthless efficiency. The miners who manipulated stars and shattered planets to provide raw materials. The Lifeworkers who preserved life and struggled to maintain ethical principles amid apocalyptic crisis. And the warrior servants who fought with honor only to be betrayed by the civilization they protected. We've seen how the rate system created extraordinary capabilities through specialization, how mutation transformed Forerunner bodies to match their functions, how rates developed distinct cultures and identities that shaped every aspect of their society. We've witnessed the political conflicts between rates, particularly the devastating rivalry between builders and warriors that crippled strategic decision-making during the flood crisis. And we've traced how this system, perfected over millions of years, ultimately became a cage that prevented the adaptation necessary for survival. The Forerunner story resonates today because it speaks to universal challenges about specialization and flexibility, about the benefits and costs of organizing societies around functional divisions, about how the very structures that enable achievement can later prevent necessary change. Every modern institution faces similar tensions. Our educational systems create specialists with deep expertise in narrow domains. Our political systems divide authority among branches with distinct functions. Our economies rely on complex supply chains where disruption of any component cascades throughout the whole. The Forerunners took these principles to an extreme, encoding specialization into flesh and bone through deliberate mutation, creating social hierarchies visible in physical form. But the underlying dynamic, the trade-off between specialized excellence and adaptive flexibility, is universal. The Forerunner rate system represents an extreme version of choices every civilization makes about how to organize itself and distribute functions among its members. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Forerunner story is how their technological sophistication couldn't save them from political and social dysfunction. They could build halo rings, but couldn't overcome rate rivalries. They could manipulate genetics with perfect precision, but couldn't escape the psychological limitations their mutations created. They could access the domain's collective knowledge, but couldn't apply that knowledge when rigid rate identities prevented synthesis of different perspectives. All their genius, all their power, all their accumulated wisdom over millions of years of history, none of it mattered when their social structure prevented them from acting effectively. The individuals we've discussed tonight, the Didact and the Librarian, Master Builder Faber and the various catalog agents, were not villains in any simple sense. They were products of their rate system, shaped by mutations and cultural conditioning to think in certain ways and value certain approaches. Their conflicts arose not from personal failing, but from fundamental incompatibilities built into their identities. They couldn't simply choose to think differently, any
more than they could choose to have different bodies. The rate system determined both. Yet some did transcend their limitations, at least partially. The Librarian's marriage to the Didact bridged rate divides, even if that bridge ultimately couldn't bear the weight placed on it. Some builders supported warrior strategies, despite rate loyalty pressuring them otherwise. The catalog agent continued investigating objectively, despite political pressure. These individual acts of integrity, while insufficient to change systemic outcomes, demonstrate that even powerful social structures don't completely determine individual choice. The legacy of the Forerunner rate system survived their civilization's fall. The installations they built, the technologies they developed, the knowledge they preserved, all bore the marks of rate specialization. When humanity discovered Forerunner artifacts, they encountered builder engineering, Lifeworker biological preserves, warrior weapon systems, each still functioning according to the principles that had guided their creation. The rate system outlasted the rates themselves, preserved in architecture and technology for 100,000 years. Humanity inherited this legacy, with all its promise and peril. The Librarian's genetic gifts activated on schedule, providing capabilities when needed. Forerunner installations recognized humans as reclaimers, granting access to technologies and knowledge. But humanity also inherited the responsibility to learn from Forerunner mistakes, to understand how a civilization so advanced could fail so completely, to avoid repeating the patterns that led to extinction. The Forerunner rate system stands as perhaps the most sophisticated example of social organization in recorded galactic history. It enabled achievements that strain imagination and created a civilization that endured for millions of years. But it also demonstrates conclusively that no amount of technological advancement can compensate for social and political dysfunction. The Forerunners could build anything except the flexibility they needed to survive. They could transform their bodies, but not their thinking. They could reshape worlds, but not their own civilization when reshaping became necessary. In the end, the rates were both the Forerunners' greatest strength and their fatal weakness. The specialization that let them build halo rings prevented them from finding alternatives to firing those rings. The hierarchies that organized their civilization efficiently made adaptation impossible when efficiency became inadequate. The mutations that gave them superhuman capabilities locked them into identities they couldn't escape, when escape became essential for survival. The ruins they left behind, the silent installations orbiting dead worlds, the dormant weapons waiting in the void, all testify to what the rate system achieved. But those same ruins, monuments to extinct civilization, testify equally to what the rate system couldn't achieve: the wisdom to survive its own success, the flexibility to adapt when circumstances changed, the unity to face existential crisis without fragmenting along the very divisions that had once made them strong. This is the legacy of the Forerunner rate system, a lesson written in the architecture of artificial worlds and encoded in the genetics of every species they preserved. Specialization enables greatness,
But greatness alone doesn't guarantee survival. Sometimes the path to transcendence requires not becoming more specialized, but becoming more whole. Not dividing more thoroughly, but integrating more completely. Not perfecting what you are, but transforming into something fundamentally different. The Forerunners couldn't make that transformation. Perhaps humanity, inheriting their legacy and learning from their failure, will prove capable of what they were not. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Forerunner civilization and the rate system that defined it, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It really helps me continue creating these long-form explorations of science fiction's most fascinating civilizations. Let me know in the comments what aspect of Halo lore you'd like me to cover next. There's so much more to explore in this universe, from the precursors who came before the Forerunners to the created uprising that threatens the galaxy and humanity's time. Until next time, sleep well, and remember that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from outside threats, but from the structures we build to protect ourselves, the specializations we develop to achieve excellence, and the divisions we create that later prevent us from standing united when unity becomes our only hope for survival. Good night, and thank you for joining me in the Cryo Bay.